Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I'm back today with another video. So now it's time to properly wrap up 2021 with an overview of my reading stats for the year, as well as a wrap up of my 2021 reading goals. And then I also wanted to include my 2022 reading goals in this video. However, I will have timestamps down in the description box below of the reading stats, reading goals wrap up, and 2022 reading goals in the event that there's a portion of that content that you are most interested in seeing. I really like reading stats because I'm a big quantitative Excel nerd person, and so I always enjoy it every year, like going through my whole Excel spreadsheet that I keep throughout the year and making some fun graphics and just like learning more about my reading and what has happened over the course of this year in terms of numbers. So in 2021, just to get started, I read 123 books, and that totaled to 39,260 pages. The month that I read the most books was May, when I read 17 books, and the month that I read the least number of books was September, when I read 3 books. And that makes sense because September was the first month that I was like fully in grad school for the whole month. You can really see throughout this graphic like what was happening at that point in my life. Like in June and July I was kind of busier, and then obviously in grad school I was busier, but then the first half of the year I had a lot more availability, particularly like March, April, May, once I was finished with my grad school app. So just kind of interesting to like look at the trends in terms of how much of my reading got done during which month. The average number of pages per book that I read was 319 pages, and 27% or 33 of the total books that I read this year were ARCs, most of which were provided to me through NetGalley. Additionally, 72% of the books, or 89 of the books I read this year, were from new to me authors, and 37% of my total number of books were debut books, some novels, some nonfiction. Of the books that I read, each book took me on average 10 days to read, which I find very interesting. Particularly, during the first half of the year, was reading a lot more books at once, and then somewhere around like June, I think I cut it down to just like 1 or 2 books at a time, and I think that actually increased my average reading speed. Even though I was reading more in the first half of the month, I was reading books for a longer period of time since I was reading more books. The median number of months that a book sat on my shelves unread was 4 months, and then as we can see here, and this does not include any library books that I read, the majority of books I read sat on my shelves for less than 6 months. So 39 of the books that I read this year sat on my shelves for less than 4 months, 31 sat on my shelves for 4 to 6 months, 21 sat on my shelves from 7 to 12 months, 12 sat on my shelves for over a year, and then 6 of the books I read this year sat on my shelf for over 2 years. So I just thought that was really interesting. I do like to kind of keep track of how long a book sits on my shelves, but also I am trying to kind of read down some of those like backlist books that I've had on my shelves for a really long time. So it's interesting to me to kind of see this breakdown. So now moving more into kind of some of the qualitative elements about like what were the books I read, how did I feel about them, and like what type of books were they. So moving first into the ratings of my 2021 year of books, I read 16 books that were 5-star reads. I read 20 books that were 4.5-star reads. I read 29 books which were 4-star reads, which was a quarter of my total reading. I read 18 books that I rated 3.5 stars, 32 books that I rated 3 stars, which was a little over a quarter of my reading. 5 books got 2.5 stars, 2 books got 2 stars, and 1 book got 1 star. I did DNF a fair amount of books this year, but I was not keeping track of that this year. In terms of the category of books, 89 of the books I read were fiction, which is 72% of my reading, 31 were nonfiction, which is 25%, and then 3 were poetry, which is the exact same number of poetry collections as I read in 2020. So I'm hopeful that in 2022 I might increase that number, although as you'll see in my goals, I am trying to read down my TBR, and I don't have a ton of poetry collections on my TBR as it stands now. Then to get more specific into a genre breakdown, the genre that I read the most from of all the genres, nonfiction and fiction, was literary fiction. That accounted to 36% of my reading, or a total of 44 books. Then the next most prominent categories were short stories. I read 10 short story collections this year. I also read 10 romance novels, both of which accounted for 8% of my reading. And then the next 3 most popular categories were all nonfiction. So I read 8 memoirs this year, 8 books that I categorized as history, and then 7 books that I categorized as politics, which is a pretty wide-ranging category that ranges from like climate change to like anti-racism books that just generally about politics and don't have a historical bent to them. Then I read 5 books that were adult fantasy, 4 books that were adult contemporary, so not quite literary fiction, but like not historical fiction either. 4 middle grade books, which were a wide range of genres, but I didn't want to include each middle grade genre as a different category, so I just included them all in middle grade, but they all had some sort of speculative element to them. I also read 4 mystery books, 4 YA fantasy books, which are the only YA books that I read. They just all happen to be fantasies. I also read 3 poetry collections, as I said, 3 essay collections that were nonfiction, 2 historical fiction novels that were not literary fiction. Then I read 2 fiction books that were other. I didn't really place them in any one category. And then I read 2 self-help books that were nonfiction, 2 books about theology that were nonfiction, and 1 book that was a like science/philosophy book that was also nonfiction. Then in terms of my age range, the vast majority of books I read each year are aimed at an adult audience. So that was 115 of the books I read, or 93% of my total reading. Then I also read 4 YA books and 4 middle grade books, as I said previously. Then for my author gender breakdown, this was pretty consistent with my 2020 reading. 101 of the books that I read this year were written by female identified authors, which was 82% of my reading. 18 books were written by male authors, which is 15% of my reading. 2 books were written by multiple authors who identify with different genders, and then 2 books were written by non-binary authors, which I think is about as many as I read last year, so I'd love to increase that in 2022. Then in terms of the race of the authors that I read, I actually am super pleased this year because my white authors made up less than 50% of my total reading, which was kind of a low-key goal of mine. So I read 58 books by white authors, which is 47% of my reading. The next most populous category, which accounted for a quarter of my reading, was Black authors. This is both Black American authors, but also some authors from Africa. And that was 32 books in total. Then the next most populous was Asian or Asian American authors. So that was 16 books, or 13% of my reading. And then I read 6 books by Indigenous authors, 5 books by Latinx authors, and then 2 books by Middle Eastern or North African authors. This kind of indicates to me that I would like to prioritize Latinx and Middle Eastern authors moving into future years, as that seems to be the area of non-white authors that I read the least amount of, and that was also true in 2020. Then moving into the medium of which I read this book, we see a huge jump in audiobooks. I think I only read like 10 audiobooks maybe in 2020, when I read 28 audiobooks in 2021, which accounted for 23% of my reading. I also read 37 ebooks, which accounted for 30% of my reading, but majority of my reading is still physical books, which accounted for 58 of the books I read this year, and that is 47% of my reading. And I will say a lot of the audiobooks that I read, I do read along physically with the audiobook from time to time, but I will count a book as read on audio if I listen to the majority of the book or listen to part of the book without reading physically. That's just how I kind of classify audio, but very rarely do I read an audiobook without having the like ebook or physical book somewhere that I can like reference, just because I do struggle a bit with like exclusively reading audiobooks. Then in terms of books I got from the library, the vast majority of books I read this year were books that I owned either physically or on ebook. So that was 110 of my books, or 89% of my reading. And then I only got 13 books from the library this year, which I did get a lot of those audiobooks that I was talking about previously from the library, so I am still a pretty avid library user, but I actually prefer using the library to consume books in a different medium that I already own. Then in terms of where I acquired books, so the majority of my books actually came from NetGalley or publishers this year. That was 35 of the books I read, or 28% of my reading. The next most popular category was from local bookstores here in Atlanta. That was 21 of the books I read this year, or 17% of my reading. Book of the month counted for 16 books I read this year, which was 13% of my reading. Then the next most populous category was library or other. I think that includes book that came from my parents' bookshelf or just from a friend or something, and that was 15 books, or 12% of my reading. Then the next most popular category is an online retailer that is like thrift books, Better World Books, etc. That was 13 of the books I read, or 11% of my reading. 10 of my books came from independent bookstores that are not either bookstores located in Atlanta or Charlottesville. I do like to visit bookstores, especially prior to the pandemic that we exist in today, from like places that I visit. And so 10 of the books that I read this year were from my travels, I guess. The other ones were kind of split between gifts, Barnes & Noble / Target, or like big box stores, Amazon Kindle. There was one book from my Charlottesville local bookstore that accounted for the other like 10-ish% of my reading. Then in terms of publication year, the vast majority of books I read are pretty like front list titles, but I did read 2 books that were published prior to 2000. I also read 6 books that were published from 2000 to 2009. Then I read 33 books that were published from 2010 to 2019. And then 28 books that were published in 2020, 53 books, the vast majority, or 43% of my reading was published in 2021, which was in large part because I was reading a lot of ARCs this year, and then 1 book is actually scheduled to be published in 2022. And then I thought it would also be interesting to talk about the kind of StoryGraph stats that they provide you, particularly the like mood stats, as I just found those to be kind of interesting. The majority of my books, and books can be classified as multiple moods, so I'm not entirely sure how they come up with this pie chart, but I just thought it was interesting and wanted to share. So at least a quarter of my books were classified as emotional reads. That was 68 of the total books that I read, and then 67 of the books were classified as reflective, which I would say that is true of my reading. I definitely like books that are both emotional and reflective, particularly reflective books. So I feel like that really checks out. Other popular moods for me were challenging, informative, and dark. I'm not really sure what dark means, but I guess 23 of the books that I read this year were considered dark. And then the moods that I read the least I thought was also interesting. I read 1 book that could be classified as relaxing, and then 4 books that could be classified as tense, and then 5 books that could be classified as hopeful, which is interesting. I feel like I like books that are hopeful, but I guess I don't read that many of them, or I didn't read that many of them in 2021. And then StoryGraph also has classified my books into the pacing of the book, and the majority of books I read, 49%, were medium-paced books. 9% of the books were fast-paced and 42% were slow-paced, which makes sense. I don't really love books that are super fast-paced, but I feel like slow-paced books sometimes get on my nerves. So that's going to wrap up the kind of stats portion of this video. Now moving into my 2021 reading goals wrap up. In 2021, I had 4 reading goals, which I talked about in a video that I will put a link to on the cards above. It was my 2021 goals / January TBR video. The first of those was to read 90 books, which, as you saw from my reading stats, I ended up reading 123. So that was accomplished, which is good. I believe I reached the 90 mark sometime around August. And then in August, I didn't feel like increasing the number because I didn't want to like stress myself out. So I just continued reading and just saw how many books I read, and 123 ended up being the final number. The second goal I had was to complete the 2021 Reading Women Challenge, and this one I did complete all 24 prompts with a couple caveats that I'll get into. I did only complete 2 of the 4 bonus prompts, but since they were bonus prompts, I wasn't gonna worry about it. And I am glad that I did so, since this was the last year of the Reading Women Challenge, as the podcast has officially ended, which is very sad. But I did, as I said, have a few caveats, the first of those being that I actually DNF'd one of the books for one of the prompts, but I DNF'd it on like the 29th of December. It was Isabel Allende's Island Beneath the Sea, which was counting for a South American author and translation. And since I DNF'd it like 2 days before the end of the year, I just wasn't gonna be able to fit another book in there. So I'm counting it technically, even though I DNF'd it. I did read like 160 pages of it though. And the other one was that I read Akwaeke Emese's Death of Vivek Oji, and Akwaeke Emese is non-binary, which I believe the prompt was a trans author, and trans and non-binary people are sometimes the same, but they're sometimes different. And I'm not sure exactly how Akwaeke Emese fits into that broader gender identity discussion. So that felt a bit of a stretch, but also it was a book I had in my TBR. If people are interested in me doing a like final wrap up for the Reading Women Challenge, do let me know down in the comment section below. I'm happy to do one. I did do a mid-year one when I'd completed probably like 3/4 of the prompts, which I'll put a link to up in the cards above. Then my third goal was to reduce my physical TBR by 24 books, and about like 3/4 the last little bit of the year, I actually adjusted this goal to be my entire TBR, including the ebooks on my Kindle, because I, as a whole, want to reduce my TBR. And also I was realizing that since I was reading so many NetGalley books, particularly in the first half of the year, that reducing my physical TBR was actually getting to be a bit challenging. So my goal now for 2021 was to reduce my whole entire TBR by 24 books. And my entire TBR was at 117 books at the start of 2021. And at the start of 2022, it is at 94 books, which is minus 23. So I'm gonna count that as a win. Then my final reading goal for 2021 was to read all the physical books on my TBR since before March of 2020, which I had forgotten about this goal. I probably forgot about it sometime around July. And so I have failed miserably. I had 24 books at the start of 2021 on my TBR from before March of 2020, and I now have 16 physical books from before March of 2020. So you do the math, that was not very good. I read like 8 of them of 24. I think that's a third. Not a very good statistic. So that was a fail, but honestly, that's less so a goal of mine now. I think reducing my TBR generally is a goal, and I am still excited about the ones that I have left from that section of my TBR. There were quite a few that I actually ended up DNFing or like unhauling, but I feel like the ones that I have left are ones I'm still genuinely interested in reading, which was kind of, I think, the overall goal of that challenge was to make sure that those books that have been sitting on my TBR for a really long time are ones I'm still intrigued about, which is pretty much the case, which kind of leads us nicely into my reading goals for 2022. So I do have a physical number reading goal, which is to read 55 books. This feels pretty accomplishable in 2022. As I said, my reading goal in 2021 was 90 books. However, I will be in grad school for like 9 of the 12 months of this year, and so I don't want to push myself too much higher than like a book a week, which is about how much I was able to read during my fall semester. But I do want to give myself a little bit of a challenge, plus I have the leeway of like the beginning of January when I'm not in school, the end of December, and then the summer where I will be working probably a 9-to-5 internship, but I won't have like schoolwork to do, so I'm assuming I might have some more reading time in the summer as well. I also have a couple other reading goals, but they're pretty like loosey-goosey just because I don't want to conform or constrict my reading too much. But my second reading goal is to have every other book I read be by a non-white author, and ideally trying to prioritize Latinx and Middle Eastern authors when I can, because as I shared in my 2021 reading stats, that is kind of a gap in my reading, I feel, which I was low-key doing this like every other book in the end of 2021, just because it really ensures that less than 50% of the books that I read are by white authors, but I kind of want to make it an official goal. And then my third reading goal, as kind of related to both of these previous two reading goals, is to continue to reduce my TBR. There's no number that I'm associating with this just because I'm not really in a great financial position to like buy a lot of new books. So increasing my TBR by like bringing in books is less of an issue for me these days, which is great. I definitely decreased my TBR the most during the time I was in grad school, just purely because I can't afford to buy new books. I do have my book of the month books coming in, but honestly, I'm pretty selective, and I'm going to continue being pretty selective, both in terms of trying to get books from book of the month that are by non-white authors, but also ones that I'm like genuinely really excited to read, because I want to kind of stay on top of my book of the month books. And so those books and then book club books are really the only books that honestly are coming into my TBR, and those are books that I'm excited about. So I don't think like bringing books in is going to be an issue, which means that the majority of books that I read are going to be taking off my TBR and thereby reducing my TBR. So I'm not going to put a specific number on this, but I really think the majority of books I will be reading this year will be from my TBR. Finally, the last of my reading goals for this year is some StoryGraph reading challenges. So I was perusing StoryGraph towards the end of the year and found a couple fun challenges, which since the Reading Women Challenge is no longer happening, I just wanted a few things to help like guide my reading for the year. And the ones that I found I'm pretty excited about. However, I'm not going to like force myself to complete any prompts that aren't really speaking to me. It's much more to like guide my reading of the books that I already have. So I will put a link to all of these reading challenges down in the description box below if any of them sound interesting to you, but I thought I'd quickly share them. The first of those is StoryGraph's genre challenge, which is 10 prompts that are pretty widespread and random. There's one that's like a nonfiction book about nature, a classic by an author of color, that type of thing. So I will just kind of be using those prompts to perhaps prioritize books for my TBR that I might not otherwise. There are a couple of prompts that I don't have any books on my TBR, and honestly are not really books I'd probably read, and I would probably just ignore those, to be perfectly honest. And then the other ones are all like monthly challenges. These are pretty open-ended prompts that go month by month to just kind of get you to think about the books on your shelves in a new and fun way, which I know the Buzzwordathon, which is one of the ones that I'll be participating in this year, has already been doing this for people, but I found 2 others as well. So the Buzzwordathon, which is put on by Books and Lala and was originally like a week-long readathon, and now it's like a year-long reading challenge, gives you 1 prompt each month. So in January, for example, the prompt is to find a book that has who, what, when, where, why, or how in the title, which I do have one for January. Another one is called the Monthly Moods 2022 Challenge, and the prompt for January for this one is a fresh start trope. So this one seems to be more genre based. And then the last one that I'm hoping to do is the 2022 Clear Your TBR Challenge. And for this one, the January prompt is a book that has your favorite colors on the cover. So again, just kind of a random thing that will maybe help inspire you to like pick up a book that you wouldn't otherwise from your TBR. So those are all my 2022 reading goals. In terms of life goals, I just have one kind of very abstract overarching life goal. I don't think my 2022 honestly is gonna be all that exciting because I'll be in grad school for, as I said, the majority of my time. I will hopefully be doing a cool internship during the summer, but I'm not expecting any like drastic life changes to happen. I am moving in July or August. I have an apartment lined up, but I don't know exactly when. The lease starts in late July, but I may not move till August, but that's gonna be an exciting thing, but that's not really a goal. I mean, that's happening. Like, I have already signed the lease and paid the security deposit. So the only like real like life goal I have is just to continue to live more intentionally with my life. And I see this kind of manifesting in a number of different ways. I'm hoping to deepen my yoga practice this year. I'm hoping to also kind of dive deeper into the concepts discussed here in the Conscious Closet, which I talked about in my catch-up wrap-up. Also just continue to ensure that like the purchases I'm making and the actions I'm taking really align with my values and feel very intentional. So I'm not going for like a whole like no buy year or low buy year or anything like that, but I do want those kind of practices and ideas to help inform my life this year, which I've already kind of been doing with grad school, but I just want to kind of continue doing that and continue living intentionally throughout the rest of 2022 as well. So those are all of my stats, reading goal wrap up, reading goals for 2022, all of that fun jazz. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any cool stats you want to share or fun reading goals that you are participating in this year, please do let me know down in the comment section below. Additionally, if you are new to my channel, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. I hope you're having a great rest of your day and a great start to 2022 whenever you watch this, and I will talk to you next time.